Hi everyone. I wanted to just chat with you a little bit more about what we've been talking about in photo design class, which is the linguistic qualities of photographic imagery. And to begin with, what I want to do is I want to go back to the triptych assignment and encourage you to do some more research and put together some triptychs based upon research imagery as a really great exercise. I was working with one of you this week and came up with a great idea, which was simply to let's go to Google and do a search for an emotion. And in fact, what I did was did a search for the word fear. Fear is an emotion that we experience. And if we go to the list of images here, we see a lot of stereotypical images that tell us something about the vocabulary related to imagery and the emotion of fear. And in fact, what we're talking about is a visual lexicon. That word lexicon is a description of all the possible ways in which we can describe the word fear. When doing research, just really try to scan through quickly and see what stands out to you. And so to me, this stood out very, very quickly. This stood out very quickly. And you see these images here as well. And you'll start to recognize that there's a visual vocabulary to describe the emotion of fear. When I was looking through the images, I grabbed some images that were pretty stereotypical, but I also found some that I thought were kind of interesting as well. What's interesting about this image is it's one of those classic horror story type images, and I want to pay attention to the fact that you see that the lighting is coming from below. It's what I call campfire spooky storytelling light, when you hold the flashlight under your face to tell a scary story. Guess what? That's unnatural lighting. As human beings, we are biologically wired to expect light to come from the sky above us, not below us, and so that adds to the fear factor in this image. Here is a classic use of shadow, and in fact, when we get to archetypes, we'll talk about the shadow archetype. And notice how the geometry of that image is so interesting graphically. This image is interesting because it uses a lot of negative space, that dark area, and then it does something else, is it only shows us one eye, and so that triggers the brain to be trying to fill in the blank. We call that the Gestalt principle of closure, and again, we'll have a lecture about Gestalt psychology and that it really impacts how we perceive. Gestalt psychology really tells us about how the brain perceives imagery. So I picked the images I thought were the strongest together, and I built this triptych that is what I would call classic narrative structure. There's kind of a beginning, middle, and end storytelling. It's a very linear story as opposed to a very abstract story. But I thought it was an interesting exercise, and I encourage you to just start experimenting with looking up different emotions. And I recommend focusing on words that are based on emotions rather than things, because ultimately as photographers we want to convey a sense of mood and emotion in our photographs. So I think that actually helps us a little bit. I also wanted to share with you this sequence of research images I played with, which was looking at some historic images, and I was looking at this historic Vietnam image by Eddie Adams, where the South Vietnamese officer was executing somebody that was believed to be a member of the Viet Cong, and it's a really tragic moment. As a visual communicator, I started thinking about what is going through the mind when that happens, and so I pulled an X-ray image. I found X-ray images of both a human head with a brain and one of an X-ray with a bullet in it, and put it to either side of it. But then I decided I wanted to go into a little bit further. I found this very historic image by Harold Edgerton that was motion studies, where he was able to use electronic strobe flash lighting. He was the developer of flash photography, to record a bullet going through an apple. And so we see that image, and now when we see this whole narrative, I'm starting with an idea on the left, the action to the left, the illustration of the potential impact, and then finally the bullet lodged in the head. And then I actually go a step further, which is to squish those elements together to kind of just play with it. And it's kind of an intense subject matter, and I apologize for that. But it's one of those things that I felt passionate about at the time because I'm really bothered by violence in general. I'm particularly bothered by gun violence in general. And so I found myself thinking, how would it feel if you had to be confronted with seeing these images? And here I'm using some very historic images to do that. Let's go back to some nicer triptych research where I was looking at shape and looking at weddings and wedding rings and tables and dancing, and then building that triptych together as well. And then also we looked at this one. Spend some time playing with imagery and seeing how sequencing together can say more than any one of those individual images can say by themselves. And I think that's the start to recognize portfolio development qualities. I believe that's the beginning for you to realize how to build a cohesive body of work and build a powerful portfolio of your imagery to actually say something. And in fact, this gives you the tools. In fact, I think this gives you the tools to go back and look at all your old photos and start pulling those out and seeing how you can build interesting combinations together. It's a great exercise for starting portfolio development. All right, let's get current, and I wanted to talk to you about the idea of juxtaposition, and I'm going to go ahead and just take a look here at some imagery. This introduces us to the idea of juxtaposition of binary opposites. And so what I'm looking for visually when I'm out photographing is I'm really paying attention to subject-background relationships, and I'm paying attention to what gives me the most sense of opposition. Here I'm looking at a white picket fence that has a Buddha on the wall. And what I'm thinking about conceptually is the American dream of the white picket fence and the very Western American ideal of basically it's a juxtaposition of Buddhism to Christianity and Puritanism of the history of the American colonies. And so for me, that was a very interesting image to make as I was on a walk one day. I also framed it. You'll notice if we were to lay an overlay on this image, that this image is framed by the natural organic shapes, and then we also have the framing of very geometric patterns with these horizontal lines, these vertical lines. So it's another juxtaposition of organic and geometric in that frame as well. And then you'll notice that if you were to draw a grid over that image, that the placement is in a upper 1/3 area where this point of interest is. So there's a lot going on in that image, even though it was actually a very quick snapshot in terms of the amount of time and effort it took to make the photograph. This is one of my favorite images that I've probably ever made in that it shows how powerful photography is, because with the act of framing, I can make a single rock on the beach as significant and important as an entire bridge structure in the background. And so we've got this one small element versus a very large element, and then as I'm watching it here now, I'm also appreciating the repetition of that one shape in the background of a single tree on the horizon line as well. But this was taken down in San Francisco at Baker Beach, one of my favorite spots to go photograph. One rock that I found there, did not place it there, and you can see that the water had smoothed out the sand around it. There's no footprints around it. And for me, it's about paying attention to the way the frame creates a relationship between the subject and the background. Here's another image I made when I was down in Los Angeles. I was at the Cabrillo Beach Yacht Club, and I was there at a time when they had a junior yacht racing class going on. And here's a young man who came early before class started and was starting to get his rigging ready for these little sailboats that I'm just blown away that they actually take them out into the open ocean. It's such a small little sailboat. And so again, this is a juxtaposition of light and dark in that these sails are very light valued. And his shirt is a long sleeve dark shirt, and he kind of stands out almost like a silhouette. It's a one-to-many juxtaposition relationship of the one sailor with all the sailboats, and then there's just all the geometry and the light and dark values that makes it very interesting. And it's backlit, and so we also have a juxtaposition of the translucent quality of light versus the solid light on the structure of the sailboat itself. So I think it's a very interesting image because of that, and it's my awareness of paying attention to opposites that allowed me to go, yes, that's an image I need to make. Here's a classic binary opposite of male-female, and in this case I also thought the girl reminded me of Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz. And so that was kind of an interesting element. And then we also have this kind of mysterious, these two people are looking at somebody who's standing, and we don't really know who that is. So there's a little bit of tension created by the not knowing what they're looking at. Here's another example of the Gestalt principle of closure and also the positive negative. We've almost got a silhouette of a partial head, and then we have a modulated light, these light and dark values on the face of this person who's in the middle of an intense conversation. And this was actually, I photographed this while I was on set for the filming of a movie, and there was a swimming pool scene, and this is actually the director who had to be in the water with the cinematographer to manage the scene being filmed that day. And I just got a tense moment of conversation between one of the production crew and the director, and that modulated light was so interesting to me. It's light, dark, sharp, out of focus. There's lots of things happening in that image. This is really more of a juxtaposition of a near and far relationship, and the idea of being stuck on the beach versus sailing away. And we also have light and dark, and there's just a lot of potential metaphoric and poetic meaning associated to that image as well. And again, that was one of my trips down to Los Angeles where I made that. This one was made closer to home. This is actually a panorama I made at Liberty Lake, and again, it's the idea of isolation, the single boat with the empty lake, a near-far relationship going on here, and also clarity and lack of clarity because of these low clouds creating this fog bank along the far horizon makes that a particularly interesting image. And then the placement, I try to avoid placing things in the bullseye middle of the frame whenever possible to create a little more movement within the frame. This is a fun one. I was on a train in San Francisco, and I just love the juxtaposition of sleeping and this image of a high energy business person. So you have lots of juxtaposition going on here. This image itself is a juxtaposition of dark values and positive values, high energy, low energy. Added to it is the Neiman Marcus slogan of "We're thrilled to be here" versus the person that looks like they're just completely bored and tired. And again, we've got opposites going on: white shirt, dark skin, and then we have dark suit, light skin. There's just a lot going on, plus there's a nice division here, and we see a reflection of the poster, and so when we connect this head, this head, this head, we will start to see the geometry that exists within this composition. This is south of San Francisco in a community called San Carlos, and I'm looking out the back window, and this is the view I see one morning. I've been there many times, spent many nights, never seen a morning quite like this. I had to go pick up my camera, and I literally photographed through a window and built a panorama. And what you see is the isolation that the fog has created for this one deciduous tree against a backdrop of so many complex shapes of trees in there. And there's actually, you can just make out in the print the Stanford campus in there in the Hoover Tower. And it's just an expansive image that remind me of Chinese scroll paintings. And again, that's where your things that you pay attention to other than photography inform your photography. And so the fact that I've gone to art shows of Chinese scroll painting, I'm interested in Asian art, added to my ability to see and recognize something worth capturing that particular morning. So again, a juxtaposition of the single full tree with all these other trees off to the side that are jam-packed together, and all these trees in the background that are just creates a lot of atmospheric depth. So this is if I were to describe in terms of design elements, this definitely is an example that emphasizes spatial relationship, space. There's a deep space to this image. This is a panning technique where I use my camera and I hold it and I pan with the action and use a slow shutter speed, about 1/15 of a second shutter speed. And what it does is it allows the subject to be a little bit more in focus than the background. And so we've got a emphasis on the design element of movement. And we have this kind of juxtaposition of in focus, out of focus, and a real sense of energy that comes with that image. This is again a isolation image of light and dark, and another juxtaposition of the one woman with the silhouettes and shadows of all the other figures. She's the only one in the light. I took this in the Portland Art Museum looking at a Rothko exhibition, and I just thought it was really the intensity of how straight up and down her arm is, and just how quiet and contemplative her expression is. Doesn't look particularly happy. And then the idea of how, in terms of metaphor, it feels very lonely with all these other people. Nobody's interacting with each other, and there's just this one person in the light. I thought it was a very interesting image, and so I made it. This one is kind of humorous in that there's a juxtaposition of heads in this frame. This is the museum security guard. You get to see his badge right here, and obviously I'm making kind of a humorous connection between the two heads. And again, we have light and dark, lots of visual contrast with that image. And for me, photographing in monochrome really helps me see the juxtaposition more clearly than the way color would work, because then I've got to be a little more sophisticated in my awareness of warm tones and cool tones to get greater juxtaposition. Again, silhouettes are always very interesting, and this to me really spoke to the human condition. And this is a question that comes up a lot. If I'm photographing, this is actually a 3D sculpture that was in the Portland Art Museum, and the idea of photographing somebody else's artwork is challenging, because how do you make the image your own? And the way you do that is you compose it. I'm not showing the whole sculpture. I'm composing it as if I were photographing a real human being, and that the gesture, and I'm paying attention. There's a term that we use called interval, which is the space between elements within the frame. So you've got this railing here on this hallway that I paid attention to so that it didn't intersect with the nose at all, and I've created isolation here. And then I chose a camera angle that allowed me to really express the weight and movement forward on the frame, and this sort of sense of self-reflection happening by that sculpture. Here's another photograph that is of artwork, and you'll see that it's a bronze sculpture of a Native American with an eagle headdress, juxtaposed with a painting that's literally across the room that I forced together into a juxtaposition of this very Victorian era, looks to me Victorian era, woman in a very big hat versus the Native American indigenous culture that's perceived to be we portray it as a little more raw, and we portray this as very formal. So there's this juxtaposition of intensity of power and enthusiasm for life versus the very tight juxtaposition of a very tight culture that's very, very formal. So we got formal and informal within that frame. And again, I'm photographing artwork in the way that I'm adding some editorial content to it by how I compose that image. I didn't just photograph the statue. This is where I like to remind you, don't Don't point your camera at things, point them at relationships, and compose an image that has feeling. There's another image I made down in, let's see. Oh, this was another image I made on a trip to Portland in the public fountain. And again, the idea of the wonderment that this child has experienced, and just the way children are so quick to want to tear off their clothes and go run in a sprinkler. And that's what this mom let this little boy do. And so here he's in his white pajama, or here he's in his white underwear, and you see how the water drops are moving, and they're bright white, almost specular white, and you just get a lot of contrast, a sense of movement and stationary, and the emotion of wonder. And I just love kind of the layers that you get with these horizontal lines that really create a sense of movement, these little cross hatches of water down here from the sprinkler. This is another juxtaposition. This was taken in Paris in front of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And what's interesting is it's a juxtaposition of young and old, and of proportion of a small boy on a larger man. And then we also have this interesting element of the person that is seeking handouts just outside the entrance of the church. And so it really is a juxtaposition of family and isolation, of lots of things going on within that frame. And that's just a quick snap on a cell phone, and yet it's one of my favorite images from that experience being in Paris. This is, again, a very formal composition, and this is about the rigid vertical lines, the vertical and horizontal lines. It's about space. This is taken at Arlington Cathedral. This was actually photographed on medium format 6x6 negative film material. And this was taken, like I said, at Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C., or just outside of Washington, D.C. And I want to also bring you this image because this goes back to what I talked about in this week's discussion, which is the idea of symmetry. This is about the idea of symmetry and having a slightly lower camera angle to bestow respect and honor to the person I'm photographing. And this is a man who went by the name of Julian, and he carried a Bible under his arm right there, standing at a street corner. The reason I was initially drawn to photograph this man was because he reminded me of a very famous photographer, Gordon Parks, who had done some incredible work that I'm just a huge fan of. And this guy just looked very dignified, wearing slacks, a tweed jacket, it's kind of a workout jacket underneath and a collared shirt, standing on the corner in Baltimore. And we've got the one man, very formal, and then we've got this out of focus security guard in the background there. And I just had an amazing experience just going up to him and asking for his permission to make this portrait, and then taking the time to just let him compose himself, like we talked about in Roland Barthes's article about daguerreotypes and that sort of thing. Compose himself, stand there, make that image, have an exchange of respect for one another, and then move on. And to me, it's one of my favorite images from that whole trip to Baltimore. Again, photographed on 6x6 film negative material. This is a juxtaposition, earth and sky. This is a mountain up in Canada, and what's interesting to me about this is the repetition of shape. The pyramid shape is also represented by a pyramid in the cloud highlights here, and I thought that was a very interesting image that I made on one of my numerous trips up in the Canadian Rockies. This image makes me think about how can I force a juxtaposition when I don't have one readily available. And one of the ways you do that is by using really shallow depth of field. And so now I've got the juxtaposition of the one in focus flower petal with the many flowers in the background that are, I'm paying attention to the interval and see how I'm making sure I get as much of an outline, a contour line of these leaves as possible, and creating some separation of light and dark values here. So one of the ways I always can come up with juxtaposition is through shallow depth of field. The other one is the panning motion action shot that I showed you earlier there. Photographs happen all the time when you least expect it. Here I am in my kitchen at home, and I was about ready to carve up this pear for a snack, and I set it on this glass cutting board, and the light coming through the window just blew me away. And so I had to make this photograph to where I'm just carefully getting the entire outline of the shape of the pear. I'm getting the shadow of the pear in the foreground, and I'm emphasizing shape, by the way, because it's backlit. It's not very three-dimensional feeling. It's very flat, but it's a really nice juxtaposition of solid versus textured, and dark shape versus light shape, the geometry of the window frame, and a picture that was sitting near the window frame, creating that image. And so always be, try to always be aware of the beauty that's in your everyday life, and make time to take those photos as well. They'll be some of your favorite portfolio images. Again, sometimes I'll just go around the house with my camera as an exploration, and I will look for something interesting. And so here is that modulated light that's created through Venetian blinds, light coming through Venetian blinds. It creates those diagonal shadows. And I also was thinking about that American Express commercial where you see a face. Anytime you see two circles, they make you think of an eye and a smile. So we have the one face in the light, and then the other one hidden down here in the shadow. Kind of reminds me of that Fear triptych that we were looking at just a little bit ago. Here is another. This is looking out at my barn, at my property, and I've got some tools sitting there. I was literally sitting in my basement office looking out the window, saw the light, had to grab my camera, went out there, and I'm taking this low camera angle because this is actually up on a hillside from where the house is. And I'm taking a low camera angle that really makes this shovel the hero of that image. And it would be a boring image if it didn't have the variation, the variety of light and dark values and the textures that light creates. So I love what we call modulated light. Anytime I see it, I tend to want to grab my camera. I think this might be the last one, and again, this was an image taken back in New Jersey a couple years ago at Christmas time. There's a pond that the somebody in the neighborhood, every year they decorate a tree and put it out on a dock and anchor it to the middle of this pond. The isolation of the single tree with the background in fog always makes for an interesting image, but I don't think it would work without this foreground element that we can see a little bit of the rocks on the shore. And without the little horizon line as well, wouldn't be nearly as interesting. And then we're back to a little Americana. This was actually at a glass blowing museum in New Jersey. Who knew that one of the most significant parts of southern New Jersey was all the silica on the beach could be converted into high quality glass. And so Dow Pharmaceuticals blew their own glass for beakers and graduates for all the pharmaceutical industry. And this was a porch setting that I took that same approach that Walker Evans takes with a lot of his composition of shooting it straight on, symmetrical, slightly slower camera angle, and it just adds a little tension to that image. And tension is not always a bad thing. It adds energy. You can feel it. You can do, you can just feel your pulse quicken a little bit as you look at that image, and then it's got light and dark. It's very energetic that way. All right, so there's some ideas for you to be thinking about as you go out to work on your juxtaposition assignment, and some ideas to be thinking about of how you can use image research to train you into the visual lexicon of communication. Thank you so much. We'll see you in class.